Sarah Mitchell stared at the lawyer's letter for the third time that morning, her coffee growing cold on the kitchen counter of her cramped Chicago apartment. The April rain drummed against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to her racing thoughts. Her grandfather, whom she hadn't seen in nearly 15 years, had passed away, leaving her his property in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. The letter described it simply as a cabin on 40 acres near a place called Pine Hollow, a name that stirred something deep in her childhood memories. At 32, Sarah's life had become a series of disappointments. Her marketing job at a downtown firm had grown soul-crushing, her relationship had ended badly 6 months ago, and her small apartment felt more like a prison than a home. She had been drifting, going through the motions, feeling disconnected from any sense of purpose or belonging. The inheritance came at a moment when she desperately needed something, anything, to change. Her phone buzzed with another work email, but she ignored it. Instead, she pulled out an old shoebox from her closet, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were a handful of childhood photographs, including one of herself at 7 years old, standing next to her grandfather outside a wooden cabin. She was holding a jar of fireflies, and his weathered hand rested gently on her shoulder. She remembered that summer visit vaguely, the smell of pine trees, the sound of a creek somewhere nearby, and her grandfather's quiet presence. They had grown apart after her parents' divorce, after her mother moved them to Chicago and cut ties with that side of the family. Sarah made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. She called her boss and took the vacation days she had been hoarding for 2 years. By the following morning, she was loading her old Honda Civic with a suitcase, a sleeping bag, and supplies for at least a week. The drive from Chicago to the Arkansas Ozarks would take about 9 hours, and she planned to use every minute to clear her head and figure out what to do with this unexpected gift from the past. The urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling farmland, then to the increasingly dramatic terrain of southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. Sarah had forgotten how beautiful this part of the country could be. The highway wound through valleys and over ridges, revealing glimpses of blue-green mountains in the distance. Spring was in full bloom here, earlier than in Chicago. Dogwood trees lined the roads, their white blossoms like scattered stars against the darker forest. Redbuds added splashes of purple-pink to the hillsides, and the fresh green of new leaves softened the landscape. She stopped for lunch in a small town called Mountain View, where the main street looked frozen in time. A diner called Martha's served her the best fried chicken she'd had in years, and the waitress, who couldn't have been younger than 70, asked if she was visiting family in the area. Sarah explained about the inheritance, and the woman's face lit up with recognition. "You must be talking about the old Mitchell place up on Bear Creek Ridge," the waitress said, refilling Sarah's sweet tea without asking. "Your grandfather was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but he was always fair and honest. That cabin's been in your family for more than 100 years, you know. There's history up there." Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity. She had known so little about her grandfather's life, about this branch of her family tree. After paying, she bought a detailed topographical map of the area from the general store next door and spent 20 minutes with the elderly shopkeeper, who circled the location of her property with a red marker and gave her detailed directions from the highway. The final leg of the journey took her off the main roads and onto increasingly narrow county highways, then onto gravel roads that climbed steadily into the mountains. The forest here was thick and old, with massive oak and hickory trees that must have been centuries old. She passed only 2 other houses in the last 5 miles, both set far back from the road. The isolation was both intimidating and oddly appealing. When she finally found the turnoff, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, "Mitchell," in faded letters, her heart began to pound. The driveway was more of a track, 2 ruts with grass growing between them, winding through the trees for a quarter mile before opening into a small clearing. And there it was. The cabin stood in a patch of afternoon sunlight, looking both exactly as she remembered and somehow smaller, more vulnerable. It was built of hand-hewn logs, darkened by age and weather, with a stone chimney rising from one end. The roof was tin, rusty in places but apparently still sound. A covered porch ran across the front, and she could see a rocking chair, a stack of firewood, and what looked like an old washtub hanging on the wall. Behind the cabin, the land rose steeply, covered in forest, while in front, The ground sloped down toward what she could hear was a creek, its water rushing over stones somewhere beyond the tree line. Sarah sat in her car for a moment, overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions. This was hers now. This piece of the mountain, this structure that her ancestors had built with their own hands. She felt the weight of that responsibility and also a strange sense of homecoming that she couldn't quite explain. The key was under the third stone step, exactly where the lawyer's letter had said it would be. The door opened with a creak that echoed across the clearing, and Sarah stepped inside, into a smell of wood smoke, dust, and time. The interior was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. A wood stove stood against one wall, a simple kitchen area with a hand-pump sink occupied another. The furniture was sparse but solid, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a reading chair near the stove, a few shelves lined with books and jars. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but nothing seemed damaged or disturbed. Afternoon light filtered through the small windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Sarah set her bags down and began to explore, opening cabinets and drawers, finding the basic implements of a simple life: cast iron pans, tin plates, a coffee pot, oil lamps, matches. Her grandfather had lived here without electricity or running water, apparently, though she noticed a newer propane lantern on the table, suggesting he'd made some concessions to modernity. In a wooden chest at the foot of what must have been her grandfather's bed in the loft, she found quilts, wool blankets, and some of his clothing, still smelling faintly of tobacco and pine. She felt a pang of grief for this man she had barely known, whose life had been lived so differently from her own. What had his days been like here? What had he thought about, sitting on that porch in the evenings? As she climbed back down from the loft, her foot caught on a loose board, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the table. When she looked back at the floor, she noticed that the board she had tripped on was not just loose but different from the others, slightly shorter, as if it had been cut that way intentionally. Curious, she knelt and worked her fingers under the edge of the board, lifting it up. Beneath the board was a shallow space, and in that space was a metal box, the kind that might have once held documents or important papers. Sarah's heart raced as she carefully lifted it out. The box was heavy, and when she shook it gently, she could hear things shifting inside. The latch was rusted but not locked, and with some effort, she managed to work it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Sarah carried the box to the table, carefully unwrapping the oilcloth. The photographs were old, some of them tintypes or early film prints, showing people in clothing from the turn of the last century. She went through them slowly, studying the faces, trying to see family resemblances. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It was a formal portrait, clearly taken in a studio, showing a family of 5. The date printed on the back read, 1905. A man stood behind a seated woman, his hand on her shoulder. 3 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12, sat in front of them. The family looked prosperous for the time and place, the man in a good suit, the woman in a high-collared dress with her hair elaborately styled. The children were scrubbed and dressed in their best clothes. They all looked directly at the camera with that serious, slightly uncomfortable expression common in old photographs. What struck Sarah most was the woman. There was something in her eyes, a strength or determination that seemed to shine through despite the formality of the portrait. Sarah turned the photograph over and found writing on the back, faded but still legible, William, Emma, and children. Pine Hollow, 1905. May God watch over us. The name resonated with Sarah. This must be her great-great-grandmother, or perhaps great-great-great-grandmother. She did the math quickly. If this Emma was around 30 in 1905, she would have been born around 1875. Sarah's grandfather had been born in 1935, so there were at least 2 generations between Emma and him. Sarah spread out the other photographs on the table. Some showed the same family at different times, the children growing older. Others showed the cabin itself, looking newer and raw-timbered, with a vegetable garden in front and chickens scratching in the yard. There were photos of neighbors or friends, of quilting bees and barn raisings, of a one-room schoolhouse with children lined up in rows. Each photograph was a window into a world that had existed right here, on this very spot, more than a century ago, but it was the journal that truly captured Sarah's attention. The leather cover was worn soft with age, and the pages inside were filled with elegant handwriting in faded ink. The first entry was dated March 12, 1905. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she began to read. "Today we had our photograph taken in town. William insisted, saying that we should have a proper family portrait to mark our 10th year in Pine Hollow. The children complained about having to dress up and sit still, but they did us proud. Little Emma squirmed terribly, and I worried she would ruin the picture, but the photographer was patient. I look at my family and feel such a mixture of pride and fear. We have built a good life here, but the weight of what I carry, what I must protect, grows heavier each day. I pray I am doing the right thing." Sarah read the entry again, her mind racing with questions. What was Emma carrying? What did she need to protect? She flipped through the journal, reading random entries, seeing mentions of daily life, planting and harvesting, births and deaths in the community, church services, and social gatherings. But woven through the mundane details were hints of something else, references to keeping the secret and protecting what was entrusted to me. As darkness fell outside and the cabin grew shadowy, Sarah lit one of the oil lamps and continued reading. She lost track of time, absorbed in Emma's words, in this voice from the past speaking directly to her across the decades. She felt a growing connection to this woman, this ancestor who had lived in this very cabin, who had perhaps sat at this very table writing these words by lamplight, just as Sarah was reading them now. Somewhere past midnight, Sarah finally closed the journal, her eyes burning from the strain of reading by lamplight and her mind spinning with questions. She made up the bed in the loft with the clean quilts she found in the chest, opened a window to let in the cool mountain air, and lay down, listening to the sounds of the forest, the creek, and the old cabin settling around her. She fell asleep thinking about Emma's words, about the hidden photograph and the mystery it represented. Tomorrow she would explore the property more thoroughly. Tomorrow, she would begin to uncover the secrets that had been hidden here for more than a century. Tomorrow, she would start to understand why that photograph of a calm Ozark family had been so important to preserve, and what Emma had been protecting all those years ago. Sarah woke to the sound of birds, dozens of them, singing in the trees around the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the loft window, and for a moment, she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The inheritance, the drive, the cabin, and the mysterious journal she had discovered the night before. She climbed down from the loft, feeling the stiffness in her muscles from the long drive and from sleeping in an unfamiliar bed. The cabin was chilly in the early morning air, and she was grateful she had thought to bring warm clothes. After starting a fire in the wood stove using kindling and logs from the supply on the porch, she made coffee using the hand pump at the sink and the camp stove she had brought with her supplies. The water from the pump was cold and clear, and she made a mental note to have it tested before drinking too much of it. As she sat at the table with her coffee, warming her hands on the mug, Sarah opened Emma's journal again and began reading from the beginning, this time more systematically. She wanted to understand the context, the full story, not just the tantalizing hints she had glimpsed the night before. The journal began in 1905, but Emma made references to earlier years, to the family's arrival in Pine Hollow in 1895, to the hardships of those first years, clearing land and building the cabin. Emma wrote about William, her husband, with clear affection and respect. He was a blacksmith by trade, and his skills had been valuable to the growing community. The children, William Jr., Thomas, and little Emma, were healthy and strong, though the journal mentioned several close calls with illness and injury, common in that era and place. But as Sarah read deeper, she began to notice a pattern. Every few months, Emma would write about receiving visitors, always described vaguely as travelers or friends passing through. These visits seemed to agitate Emma, filling her entries with worry and references to the burden she carried. After each visit, she would write about checking the safe place and ensuring all is well hidden. One entry from July 1905 was particularly intriguing. Another group came through last night. 3 this time, including a young mother with a baby barely 6 months old. My heart broke to see their exhaustion and fear. We gave them food, clean clothes, and a safe place to rest for 2 days. William repaired the young man's boots, and I mended the woman's dress. Before they left, I showed them the map, as I always do, and took them to the place so they would know it was real, so they would have hope. The baby smiled at me, and I thought of my own children, how blessed they are to grow up in safety and freedom. I pray these travelers reach their destination safely. I pray the secret stays hidden for as long as it is needed. Sarah set down the journal, her mind racing. The language Emma used, the references to travelers seeking safety and freedom, to showing them maps and the place, all pointed to something specific. And then it hit her, a piece of history she had learned in school but had never connected to her own family. The Underground Railroad, but that couldn't be right, could it? The Underground Railroad had primarily operated before the Civil War, helping enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. The war had ended in 1865, 40 years before Emma wrote this journal. Yet her words clearly described people traveling in secret, seeking safety and freedom. What could it mean? Sarah grabbed her laptop from her bag and was disappointed but not surprised to find that there was no cell service or Wi-Fi at the cabin. She would need to drive into town to use the internet at a library or cafe. But first, she wanted to explore the property more thoroughly, to see if she could find what Emma referred to as the place or the safe place. She spent the morning walking the land, following old paths through the forest, discovering the boundaries of the property marked by ancient stone cairns and rusty barbed wire. She found the creek, which was larger than she had expected, running swift and clear over a rocky bed. She found the remains of what must have been the garden Emma mentioned, now overgrown but still marked by old fruit trees, their gnarled branches heavy with new blossoms. Behind the cabin, the mountain rose steeply, covered in thick forest. Sarah hiked up the slope, pushing through underbrush and ducking under low branches. The climb was difficult, and she was breathing hard by the time she reached a point where the slope leveled off onto a small bench of land. Here, the forest was older, the trees massive, creating a canopy so thick that the ground below was relatively clear of undergrowth. She almost missed it. The entrance was just a dark opening in the hillside, partially hidden by a fallen tree and decades of growth. A cave, or perhaps a mine? Sarah felt a thrill of discovery mixed with caution. She had no flashlight, no proper equipment for exploring caves. But she had to know if this was the place Emma had written about. Using her phone's flashlight, Sarah approached the entrance carefully. The opening was narrow but tall enough for her to enter without crouching. Just inside, the passage widened into a chamber about the size of her Chicago living room. The air was cool and dry, and the cave seemed to be natural, not man-made. But what caught her attention were the signs of human use. Against one wall, she could see the remains of wooden shelving, now collapsed and rotting. There were rusted tin cans, the remnants of blankets or clothing, and most telling, marks on the wall. Scratches, drawings, initials carved into the soft limestone. Sarah's light caught on words scratched near the entrance. "Thank you. Safe passage. 1906. This was it. This was Emma's safe place." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warmth of the spring morning. Her ancestors had used this cave to shelter travelers, people seeking safety and freedom. But who were they? If not escaped slaves, then who? She spent another hour exploring the cave, finding more evidence of its use. The remains of a fire pit, carefully built to minimize smoke, more messages scratched into the walls, dates ranging from 1895 to 1918. Some messages were in languages she didn't recognize. One section of wall had what appeared to be a crude map, showing the creek, the cabin, and what might have been routes through the mountains. When she finally emerged back into the daylight, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the weight of what she had discovered. Her family had been part of something significant, something secret and dangerous. She needed to know more, needed to understand the full story. She made her way back down to the cabin, gathered her laptop and some of Emma's documents, and drove into town. The public library in Mountain View was small but well-maintained, with a friendly librarian named Dorothy who set Sarah up at a computer with internet access. Sarah spent the next several hours researching, following threads of information, learning about a history she had never known existed. She discovered that after the Civil War, the Ozark Mountains had become a refuge for people fleeing violence and persecution in other parts of the South and beyond. During the Reconstruction era and the decades that followed, there were waves of migration. Black families fleeing racial violence and Jim Crow laws, immigrants escaping persecution in Europe, labor activists fleeing violence in the coal mining regions. The Ozarks, with their remote valleys and independent-minded residents, had offered safety to many who needed it. Sarah found academic papers about underground networks that had operated in the region, helping people relocate and start new lives. She found newspaper articles from the early 1900s about violent strikes in the coal mines of nearby regions, about racial pogroms in the South, about waves of immigrants arriving at American ports and making their way inland. Some articles mentioned mysterious sympathizers in the Ozarks who helped these migrants, though details were always vague. She read about communities of black homesteaders who had established themselves in the Ozarks in the late 1800s and early 1900s, seeking land and safety away from the violence of the post-Reconstruction South. She learned about labor organizers who had fled to the mountains after strikes turned violent, about religious minorities who had sought refuge there, about political radicals escaping persecution. The more Sarah read, the more Emma's journal made sense. Her family had been part of an informal network, helping people in need, offering shelter and support to those traveling through the mountains seeking safety and new beginnings. It had been dangerous work, likely disapproved of by some neighbors and authorities. Emma's secrecy made sense. She had been protecting not just the travelers but her own family. By late afternoon, Sarah's head was spinning with information. She checked out several books about Ozark history and made copies of relevant articles. As she was leaving the library, Dorothy stopped her. "Finding what you're looking for, dear?" the librarian asked kindly. Sarah hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "I'm researching my family history. My ancestors lived in Pine Hollow, and I'm trying to understand what their lives were like." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Mitchell family? Your grandfather just passed, didn't he? I'm so sorry for your loss. The Mitchells have been in these parts for a very long time. You know, there are some old-timers who might remember stories. There's a historical society that meets once a month. We're actually meeting tonight at the community center if you'd like to come. We always welcome visitors, especially ones with family connections to the area." Sarah accepted the invitation, grateful for the opportunity to learn more. The meeting wasn't until 7, so she drove back to the cabin to review Emma's journal with her new understanding. The words took on new meaning now that she knew the context. Emma had been documenting not just her family's daily life but a secret mission of compassion and courage. That evening, Sarah drove back to town and found the community center, a simple building next to the library. Inside, about 20 people, mostly elderly, were setting up chairs and arranging cookies and coffee. Dorothy introduced Sarah around, and she found herself warmly welcomed. The Historical Society's meeting was informal, with various members sharing stories and showing artifacts related to local history. When there was a pause, Dorothy spoke up. "Sarah here is researching her family, the Mitchells from Pine Hollow. Does anyone remember them or have stories to share?" An elderly man in the back raised his hand. "I'm 94 years old, and my grandfather used to talk about the Mitchells. Said they were good people, always willing to help a neighbor. He also said..." The man paused, looking around the room as if deciding whether to continue. He said that during hard times, folks knew they could count on the Mitchells for more than just neighborly help, if you catch my meaning. A woman across the room nodded. "My grandmother mentioned something similar. She always said the Mitchells were part of the quiet network. I never knew what that meant exactly, but she spoke of it with respect." Another man, perhaps in his 70s, leaned forward. "There's a story my daddy told me about a time in the early 1900s when some black families were trying to settle in this area, and they met with resistance from certain folks who didn't want them here. The Mitchells and a few other families stood up for them, made sure they got fair treatment and a chance to buy land and build homes. It wasn't a popular stance at the time, but the Mitchells never backed down." Sarah listened, her heart full, as story after story emerged. Her family had been part of the community's better angels, people who had stood for what was right even when it was difficult or dangerous. By the end of the evening, she had filled several pages of notes and received invitations to visit other families who might have more stories or documents to share. Driving back to the cabin that night, Sarah felt a profound connection to Emma and William, to the life they had built and the values they had upheld. The photograph from 1905, the one showing a calm family, now told a deeper story. That calm had been hard-won, maintained despite the risks they took and the secrets they kept. Emma's prayer, "May God watch over us," took on new significance. They had needed protection, not just for themselves but for all those they helped. Back at the cabin, Sarah lit the lamps and returned to the journal, reading with new understanding. She was determined to piece together the full story, to honor Emma's legacy by bringing it to light. But there was still something she hadn't found, something Emma referred to repeatedly in her later entries: the full record and the names and stories preserved. Sarah looked around the cabin with fresh eyes. If there was more to find, where would Emma have hidden it? The metal box under the floorboard had contained the journal and photographs, but Emma's writing suggested there was more, a complete record of the people they had helped. That kind of document would have been incredibly dangerous to keep but also incredibly important. Where would someone hide something like that in 1905? She thought about the cabin's construction, about the hiding places that might have been built into its very structure. She examined the walls, the floor, the loft, the chimney, tapping and pressing, looking for hollow sounds or hidden compartments. She checked the furniture, the shelves, the door and window frames. Hours passed, and she found nothing. Exhausted, she made herself some dinner and sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The view was spectacular, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, the forest below dark and mysterious. She thought about Emma sitting here, looking at this same view, carrying the weight of her secrets. And then Sarah remembered something from the journal, a passage she had read quickly and not fully processed. She went back inside and flipped through the pages until she found it. An entry from 1910. "Today I showed young Emma, now 15, the place where I keep the full record. She is old enough now to know the truth, to carry the responsibility if something should happen to William and me. I chose the place our first year here, when William built the chimney. He understood why it was necessary, though it pained him to seal it up. Someday, when it is safe, someone will find it and know what we did, who we helped. Until then, it rests in the stones, protected by fire and time." The chimney. Sarah's heart raced. Emma had hidden something in the chimney, sealed behind stones when it was built in 1895. She went to examine the structure, running her hands over the stones inside and out, looking for any sign of a hiding place. The chimney was massive, built to last, with stones carefully fitted together. How could there be a hiding place that wouldn't compromise its structure? She remembered that chimneys often had clean-out doors at the bottom, allowing access to remove ashes and debris. This one had a small iron door, rusted shut. Sarah found tools in a shed behind the cabin and worked carefully to open it without damaging anything. After 20 minutes of effort, the door finally swung open. Inside, below the level of the firebox, there was a small cavity deliberately created during construction. And in that cavity, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and sealed with wax, was another metal box, larger than the first. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled it out, carefully breaking the wax seal and unwrapping the oilcloth. The box opened to reveal more documents, more photographs, but most importantly, a larger leather-bound book. On its cover, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "The record of those we helped, 1895 to 1918. Sarah carried the book to the table and opened it. Inside were names, dates, descriptions, and short narratives. Each entry documented a person or family that had passed through Pine Hollow, seeking safety or a new beginning. Emma had recorded not just the basic facts but pieces of their stories, where they had come from, what they were fleeing, where they hoped to go, how the Mitchells had helped them. Sarah began to read, and tears filled her eyes as the magnitude of what her ancestors had done became clear. Here were the names and faces, the real people behind the history books. Families fleeing racial violence in Missouri and Arkansas, miners fleeing brutal conditions and violent strike-breaking in Oklahoma and Kansas, immigrants who had been cheated or exploited and needed help finding honest work and safe communities, women fleeing dangerous situations, political activists escaping persecution, young people seeking education and opportunities they couldn't find in the places they came from. The entries spanned more than 2 decades and included hundreds of people. For each one, Emma had written something personal, some detail that humanized them. Mary Johnson, age 24, with 3 children under 5. Her husband was killed in a labor dispute. She hoped to reach her sister in Kansas. She played the harmonica beautifully and taught my Emma a song. I gave her my good winter coat. Or Samuel Reeves, age 16, traveling alone from Mississippi. Wanted to learn to read and write. Stayed with us for 3 weeks while William taught him. Sharp mind, kind heart. He carved a whistle for little Emma before he left. As dawn broke, Sarah was still reading, absorbing the stories, feeling the presence of all these people who had passed through this place, whose lives had been touched by her ancestors' courage and compassion. This was the hidden story behind that calm 1905 photograph. This was what Emma had been protecting, what she had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Sarah knew that she had discovered something extraordinary, a piece of history that deserved to be known and honored. But she also understood Emma's caution. Even now, more than a century later, these stories raised questions about justice, rights, and the kind of society people wanted to build. This was not just her family's history, it was American history, the complex and difficult kind that didn't always make it into textbooks. She had to decide what to do with this discovery. The weight of that decision felt enormous as the morning sun lit the cabin and began a new day. For the next week, Sarah immersed herself in Emma's records, barely leaving the cabin except for necessary trips to town for supplies. She read every entry in the large leather-bound book, making careful notes and creating a system to organize the information. Each story moved her, made her angry at the injustices people had faced, and filled her with pride in what her ancestors had done. She learned that William and Emma had not worked alone. The records mentioned other families in the area who were part of the network, though Emma used only first names or initials, never full identification. There were references to J.M. in Calico Rock, and the Reverend in Mountain View, and the teacher in Marshall. These co-conspirators had passed travelers from one safe house to the next, creating a chain of compassion and protection across the Ozarks. The spring weather turned warmer, and Sarah developed a routine. She rose with the sun, made coffee on the wood stove, and spent her mornings reading and transcribing Emma's records on her laptop, typing in the cabin and then driving to town in the afternoons to use the library's Wi-Fi to back up her files to the cloud. She couldn't risk losing this information. During her visits to town, she got to know more of the local people. Dorothy at the library became a friend and source of local knowledge. Sarah met with several descendants of other old families, people whose ancestors might have been part of the same network. She approached these conversations carefully, not wanting to reveal everything she knew but fishing for information that might corroborate or expand on Emma's records. One elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, whose family had lived in Calico Rock for generations, confirmed that her grandfather had been known for helping travelers in the early 1900s. My grandmother said he believed that when people needed help, you helped them, no matter the cost or what others might think, Eleanor said over tea in her tidy Victorian house. She said there were others who felt the same way, that they worked together. She mentioned the Mitchells specifically, said they were leaders in those efforts. Sarah also contacted the history department at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, speaking with a professor who specialized in migration patterns and social movements in the Ozarks during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Professor Martinez was fascinated by Sarah's preliminary findings and encouraged her to document everything carefully, explaining that such detailed records were extremely rare and historically significant. What you found is primary source material that could change our understanding of this period, Professor Martinez told her during a phone call. We know there were informal networks helping people during this era, but we've had very little documentation. Most people involved were too cautious to write things down, or records were destroyed. If your ancestor kept detailed records and they survived, that's extraordinary. The professor cautioned her to think carefully about how to handle the information, suggesting she consult with archivists about proper preservation and with legal experts about any privacy concerns, even though everyone involved had been dead for decades. He also connected her with a colleague who studied the African American experience in the Ozarks, and Sarah ended up having a long conversation with Professor James Williams about the broader context of racial migration and the establishment of black communities in the region. The period from 1890 to 1920 was particularly dangerous for black families in the South, Professor Williams explained. Lynchings, violent dispossession of land, the entrenchment of Jim Crow laws. Many people fled north, but some came to places like the Ozarks, hoping to find land and safety away from the most violent areas. That they found allies among white residents who were willing to help them, and to do so at personal risk, is significant. These stories need to be told. As Sarah learned more about the historical context, she returned repeatedly to Emma's journal, finding new meaning in entries she had read before. She discovered that Emma had documented not just the people who passed through but also the threats and challenges the family faced because of their activities. An entry from 1908 was particularly harrowing. Last night, men came to the house. 6 of them, some I recognized from town, others strangers. They had heard rumors, they said, about our sympathies with the wrong sort of people. They wanted to search the property. William stood on the porch with his rifle, and I stood beside him with mine. We told them they were not welcome, that they should leave our land. Thomas and young William were in the loft with instructions to protect their sister no matter what happened. The confrontation lasted an hour, voices raised, threats made. But they left. They left because William's reputation as a fair man and a skilled blacksmith had weight in the community, because they were not entirely sure of their accusations, and because they could see we would defend our home. After they left, we moved the travelers who were hiding in the cave to another location immediately. I did not sleep for 3 days, waiting for them to return. They never did, but we were more careful after that. Sarah felt her throat tighten reading this. Her ancestors had risked everything, their safety, their lives, their children's futures, for their principles. The Comm family in the 1905 photograph had been living with constant danger and fear, yet they had continued their work for another 13 years after that photo was taken. She found evidence of the personal cost in other entries. Emma wrote about the isolation that came from keeping secrets, about friendships that cooled when neighbors suspected but couldn't prove the Mitchells' activities, about the strain on the marriage during particularly dangerous periods, about the weight of teaching her children to lie about what they knew, even as she taught them the importance of truth and integrity. But there were also entries filled with joy and satisfaction. Emma wrote about receiving letters from people they had helped, people who had reached safety and built new lives. She wrote about a family reunion in 1912 where a black family they had helped 5 years earlier traveled back to Pine Hollow to introduce their new baby, named Emma in honor of her. She wrote about the deep friendships formed with others in the network, people bound together by shared values and shared risks. One entry from 1915 particularly moved Sarah. Today I realize that little Emma, now 20, has known no other life than this work. She grew up helping us prepare food for travelers, listening to their stories, understanding from an early age that people are people, regardless of the color of their skin or where they come from. She has learned compassion and courage, and I am proud of the woman she is becoming. She told me today that she wants to become a teacher, so she can help more people in a different way. She wants to teach children to read and think for themselves, to question injustice. My heart swells with pride. Sarah researched this little Emma, and discovered that she had indeed become a teacher, working in one-room schoolhouses throughout the Ozarks for 40 years. She had never married, dedicating her life to education. She had been Sarah's great-grandmother's aunt, and by some accounts, a woman ahead of her time, teaching not just reading and arithmetic but also critical thinking and social responsibility. As the days passed, Sarah found herself feeling more grounded and purposeful than she had in years. The work of documenting Emma's records gave her life structure and meaning. The mountain air, the physical work of maintaining the cabin, and the simple routines of cooking on the wood stove and fetching water from the pump were therapeutic. She slept better than she had in Chicago, despite the harder bed and quieter nights. She also found herself changing in other ways. Her perspective on her own problems shifted. The career disappointments and relationship failures that had seemed so crushing a few weeks ago now felt smaller, more manageable. She had been drifting, yes, but she came from people who had purpose and conviction. That was in her blood, part of her inheritance just as much as the cabin and the land. One afternoon, while taking a break from transcribing, Sarah hiked back up to the cave. She brought a better flashlight this time and explored more thoroughly. She found more messages scratched into the walls, more evidence of the people who had sheltered there. She also found something she had missed before, a shelf carved into the rock at the very back of the cave, and on that shelf, wrapped in rotting fabric, several small objects. A child's doll, handmade from cloth scraps. A tin cup with a dent in it. A small knife with carved bone handles. A book of prayers in Hebrew. These were belongings left behind, deliberately or accidentally, by the travelers. Each one represented a person, a story, a life that had intersected with this place. Sarah carefully photographed each item in place, documenting exactly where she found it, then gently collected them to preserve and eventually include in whatever record or presentation she decided to create. These artifacts made the stories in Emma's book even more real, gave them physical presence. Back at the cabin, she spread the objects on the table alongside the photographs and documents. She took pictures of everything together, creating a visual record. Then she sat down and drafted a plan. She would create a comprehensive digital archive of all the materials. She would work with historians to contextualize the information. She would consider creating an exhibit, perhaps in partnership with the local historical society or a university. She would write Emma's story, give voice to the people who had passed through Pine Hollow seeking safety and new beginnings. But even as she made these plans, Sarah felt uncertain. The story was powerful, but it was also complicated. It raised uncomfortable questions about the past and present, about who had been helped and who hadn't, about the ongoing struggles for justice and equality in America. She wanted to honor Emma's courage without sanitizing the harder truths about the period, without turning the story into something simplistic or self-congratulatory. She called Professor Martinez again and talked through her concerns. He encouraged her to proceed, but to do so thoughtfully, in consultation with communities whose ancestors might be represented in the records, particularly Black historians and descendants of African Americans who had migrated through the region. He stressed the importance of telling the story in a way that centered the experiences and voices of the people who had needed help, not just the people who provided it. "Your ancestor did something remarkable," he said, "but the truly remarkable thing was the courage and determination of the people who left everything behind to seek safety and new opportunities. They are the heroes of this story." Emma and William were facilitators, allies. That's important, but it's a supporting role, not the lead. Sarah took this advice to heart. She began to research the destinations Emma's records mentioned, trying to trace what had happened to some of the people after they left Pine Hollow. It was difficult work, as many had used assumed names or had moved multiple times, but she had some success. She found census records that might match some of the travelers. She discovered a photograph in the Arkansas State Archives that showed a Black community in the 1920s, and in it, a face that looked remarkably like one in the photographs from Emma's box. She reached out to genealogy groups and historical societies in Black communities throughout Arkansas and neighboring states, explaining what she had found and asking if anyone was researching family members who might have passed through the Ozarks in the early 1900s. The responses were initially slow, but then she received an email that made her heart race. A woman named Teresa Johnson wrote, "My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Reeves, left Mississippi around 1905 when he was a teenager, fleeing violence. Family stories say he spent time in Arkansas, in the mountains, where a white family helped him learn to read and write before he continued to Kansas. He always spoke with gratitude about that time, though he never gave names or specific locations. From your description, I believe he might be in your ancestors' records. Could we arrange to talk?" Sarah called Teresa that evening, and they spoke for 2 hours. Teresa was a retired school teacher in Kansas City, and she had been researching her family history for years. When Sarah read her the entry Emma had written about Samuel Reeves, Teresa began to cry. It matched the family stories perfectly, confirming details that had been passed down through generations but never verified. "You have no idea what this means," Teresa said. "To have written proof, to know that someone documented his courage and his journey, to see that he was valued and respected, this is a gift beyond measure." Would it be possible for me to see the original record? Sarah assured her it would, and they made plans for Teresa to visit Pine Hollow in a few weeks. The conversation was emotional and powerful, and when it ended, Sarah felt both energized and humbled. This wasn't just an academic exercise or a personal journey. This was about connecting people to their histories, about honoring lives that had been lived bravely and often without recognition. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah received a half-dozen similar inquiries, each one leading to conversations with descendants who were moved and grateful to learn more about their ancestors' journeys. Not all the connections could be definitively confirmed, but even the possibilities were meaningful. Sarah began to understand the true value of what Emma had created, not just a historical record but a bridge across time, connecting past and present, honoring lives that might otherwise have been forgotten. She also began to understand her own place in this story. She was not just an heir to property but an heir to responsibility. Emma had preserved these records with the hope that someday, when it was safe, they would be found and the stories would be told. Sarah was that someday. It was her job now to carry this forward, to ensure that Emma's work and the courage of all the people in those records were not forgotten. As May turned into June, Sarah made a decision. She would not return to Chicago, at least not permanently. She would extend her leave from work, and if necessary, quit her job. The cabin, the land, the work of documenting and sharing this history, this was where she needed to be. This was her purpose, at least for now. The marketing job, the apartment, the life she had been living all felt distant and unimportant compared to what she had found here. She called her mother for the first time since arriving in Arkansas, a conversation she had been putting off. She explained where she was, what she had found, and what she had decided. Her mother was surprised and, after some initial resistance, supportive. They talked about the family history, about the divorce and the estrangement from that side of the family, about regrets and missed opportunities. It was the most honest conversation they had had in years. "Your grandfather was a good man," her mother admitted. "I was angry at a lot of things back then, and I let that anger cut you off from him. I'm sorry for that. I'm glad you're getting to know him now, even if it's through what he left behind." Sarah felt a weight lift. She had been carrying guilt about not knowing her grandfather, about not being there at the end of his life, but she understood now that circumstances had been complicated, that blame was not useful. What mattered was moving forward, honoring his memory and Emma's legacy in the best way she could. That night, sitting on the porch under a canopy of stars, Sarah felt more at peace than she could remember. The sounds of the forest, the smell of the mountain air, the solid presence of the cabin behind her, all of it felt right. She was home, in a way she had never been home before. And she had work to do, important work that mattered. She thought about the photograph from 1905, the calm family with their secret burden and their quiet heroism. She thought about all the people who had passed through this place, seeking safety and new beginnings. She thought about Emma, sitting here on this same porch, watching the same stars, carrying the weight of her choices with grace and determination. Sarah whispered to the night, to the ghosts of the past, to Emma's spirit if it lingered in this place, "I found your records. I understand what you did. I will tell your story, and I will honor the people you helped. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for this gift." The forest seemed to rustle in response, or perhaps it was just the wind. Either way, Sarah felt heard and connected, part of a chain of meaning that stretched back through generations and forward into a future she was only beginning to imagine. By midsummer, Sarah's project had taken on a life of its own. The cabin had become a workspace, with her laptop on the table, documents carefully organized in archival boxes she had purchased, and a growing collection of research materials. She had officially resigned from her job in Chicago, much to the surprise of her former colleagues, and had begun the process of making her move to Arkansas permanent. The first visitor was Teresa Johnson, Samuel Reeves' great-great-granddaughter. She arrived on a warm Saturday in June with her adult children and grandchildren, 3 generations coming to see the place where their ancestor had found help and hope more than a century ago. Sarah had spent days preparing, cleaning the cabin thoroughly, organizing the documents, and planning how to share the information respectfully. When Teresa walked into the clearing and saw the cabin, she stopped and put her hand to her heart. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is where he came." Her family gathered around her, and Sarah gave them time to take in the moment before inviting them inside. Sarah had set up a display on the table, Emma's original entry about Samuel, a photograph that might have been him. It was labeled only SR 1905, but matched the description, and the carved whistle that Emma mentioned he had made for her daughter. Teresa touched each item gently, as if they were sacred relics, which in a way, they were. "May I read the entry aloud?" Teresa asked, and Sarah nodded. Teresa's voice shook as she read Emma's words about her great-great-grandfather, about his sharp mind and kind heart, about the 3 weeks he spent learning to read and write from William Mitchell. Her grandchildren listened, some with tears in their eyes, as their family's history became real and tangible in a new way. Afterward, Sarah took them up to the cave, showing them where Samuel would have sheltered, where he would have slept and eaten and planned his next steps. They stood in silence for a long time, each person absorbed in their own thoughts and emotions. On the way back down, Teresa's son, a tall man named Marcus who taught history at a high school in Kansas City, asked Sarah about her plans for the records. "I want to preserve them properly and make them available to researchers and descendants," Sarah explained. "I'm working with the University of Arkansas to create a digital archive. I'm also considering whether to create some kind of physical exhibit, maybe here on the property or in partnership with a museum. But mostly, I want to make sure the information is accessible to people like you, people whose families are part of this history." Marcus nodded approvingly. "What you're doing is important. This kind of documentation is rare. My great-great-grandfather's story was almost lost, kept alive only through oral tradition. Having it verified, having details we never knew, this is invaluable." Before they left, the family stood in front of the cabin for a photograph, holding a sign that Teresa had brought, "In honor of Samuel Reeves and the Mitchell family, June 2025. They promised to stay in touch, and Teresa hugged Sarah tightly, whispering, "Thank you for honoring our ancestor and for caring about this history." That visit set the pattern for others. Over the summer, several more descendants made the journey to Pine Hollow. Each visit was emotional and profound. Each one reinforced for Sarah the importance of the work she was doing. She learned more about the people in Emma's records through these visits, filling in gaps in the stories, adding new layers of understanding. She also worked with Professor Martinez and a team of graduate students to create a comprehensive digital archive. They scanned every page of Emma's records in high resolution, transcribed the handwriting, cross-referenced the information with other historical records, and created a database that would be searchable and accessible. The university agreed to host the archive on its servers and to help create an educational website that would provide context and analysis. Professor Williams, the scholar of African American history in the Ozarks, became a close collaborator. He helped Sarah understand the broader implications of what Emma had documented, connecting the individual stories to larger patterns of migration, resistance, and community formation. He also helped her navigate sensitive questions about how to tell these stories responsibly, ensuring that the voices and experiences of the people who had needed help remained central. "What your ancestor did was important," he told Sarah during one of his visits to the cabin, "but it's crucial that we don't create a white savior narrative." Emma and William were allies, people who made brave choices, but they were part of a much larger story of Black resistance and self-determination. The people they helped were not passive victims. They were agents of their own liberation, making incredibly difficult and courageous decisions to leave everything behind and start over. We need to honor that agency and courage. Sarah took this guidance seriously, revising her approach and focusing on centering the experiences of the travelers themselves. She worked to find additional records and documents that would tell their stories beyond just their time in Pine Hollow, trying to trace their later lives and accomplishments. As summer progressed, Sarah also invested time in the property itself. She repaired the cabin's roof where it was leaking, cleared brush from around the building, restored the garden space, and began thinking about how to make the site accessible for visitors while preserving its historical character. She consulted with a local contractor about building a small visitor center, separate from the cabin, where information could be displayed and where visitors could watch videos or examine reproductions of the documents without risking damage to the originals. The local community embraced the project enthusiastically. The Historical Society helped organize fundraisers to support the work. Local businesses donated materials and services. School groups began requesting tours, and Sarah found herself giving presentations to children and adults about the history of Pine Hollow and the broader history of migration and social justice in the Ozarks. Dorothy from the library became an invaluable partner, helping Sarah connect with other local historians, organizing speaker events, and generally championing the project throughout the community. "This is our history too," Dorothy said. "These were our ancestors who stood up for what was right. We should be proud of that and learn from it." Not everyone was entirely comfortable with the project. Sarah encountered some resistance from people who preferred to think of the past as simpler and less complicated, who didn't want to acknowledge the racial violence and injustice that Emma's records made undeniable. A few anonymous letters to the local newspaper questioned whether Sarah was stirring up old troubles or trying to make people feel guilty about the past. Sarah responded by speaking at a town hall meeting, explaining her intentions clearly and emphasizing that the project was about honoring courage and compassion, not assigning blame. "My ancestors took risks to help people who needed it," she said. "That's not a shameful history, it's a proud one. Understanding the context, why help was needed, what people were fleeing from, doesn't diminish that. It makes it more meaningful. This history challenges us to think about what we would do in similar circumstances, what kind of community we want to be now." Her straightforward approach won over most skeptics, and while there remained some grumbling, the community generally supported her work. As fall arrived and the mountains exploded in color, Sarah received an invitation that surprised and excited her. A documentary filmmaker from Little Rock had heard about the project and wanted to create a film about Pine Hollow and Emma's records. After careful consideration and consultation with her advisors, Sarah agreed, with the condition that the film would center the stories of the travelers and their descendants, not just the Mitchell family's role. The filmmaker, a woman named Janet Monroe, spent several weeks in Pine Hollow, interviewing Sarah, filming the cabin and cave, and traveling to interview descendants of the people in Emma's records. The result was a powerful hour-long documentary that premiered at a film festival in Little Rock in November and was subsequently picked up by PBS for national broadcast. The documentary brought even more attention to the project. Sarah found herself doing interviews with journalists, giving talks at universities, and corresponding with researchers from around the country who were interested in similar stories of grassroots compassion and resistance networks. The cabin in Pine Hollow, once a forgotten piece of family property, had become a site of historical significance, a place where people came to connect with a particular kind of American story, not the story of great leaders and famous battles, but the story of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Through all of this, Sarah continued to read and reread Emma's journal, finding new insights each time. One entry, from late in Emma's life, became particularly meaningful to Sarah. It was dated December 1920. "I am an old woman now, and the work we did seems like another lifetime. The world has changed so much, and yet in many ways, it has not changed enough. The need for compassion, for courage, for people willing to stand up for what is right, that need never goes away. I hope that someday, someone in our family will find these records and understand what we tried to do. I hope they will be inspired to do their own part, in their own time, to make the world a little better, a little more just. That is all any of us can do, our part in our time." Sarah felt as if Emma had written those words directly to her, across the span of a century. She had found the records, she had understood, and she was doing her part. It felt like a fulfillment of a promise she hadn't known she had made, a closing of a circle that had been left open for too long. In December, Sarah organized a gathering at the cabin to celebrate the completion of the digital archive and the official opening of Pine Hollow as a historical site. Dozens of people attended, descendants of the people in Emma's records, local community members, scholars, students, and friends Sarah had made during her months in Arkansas. They gathered in the clearing in front of the cabin on a cold but clear day, and Sarah spoke about what the project had meant to her. "When I arrived here 9 months ago," she said, "I was lost. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I found it anyway. I found my family's history, and through that, I found a sense of purpose and connection that I had been missing. But more importantly, I found a story that isn't just about my family. It's about all the people who have ever needed help, who have ever had to flee danger or seek new opportunities. It's about the people who chose to help them, who took risks for strangers because it was the right thing to do. And it's about the ongoing work of building a society based on compassion and justice, work that is never finished, that each generation must take up in its own way. She unveiled a plaque that would be mounted on the cabin, dedicating it as a historical site in honor of Emma and William Mitchell and all the people they had helped. The plaque included a quote from Emma's journal: "We all have a part to play in making the world better. This was ours." After the ceremony, people toured the cabin, viewed the displays, and shared their own family stories. Teresa Johnson and her family had returned for the event, and she gave a short speech about what finding her great-great-grandfather's story had meant to her family. Others shared similar testimonies. There was laughter and tears, music and food, a celebration that felt both joyful and sacred. As evening approached and people began to leave, Sarah stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains just as Emma must have done countless times. She thought about the photograph from 1905, the image that had started this whole journey. That calm family had been hiding a world of courage and compassion behind their formal poses. They had done extraordinary things in quiet, unheralded ways. Marcus, Teresa's son, joined her on the porch. "What's next for you?" he asked. "Will you stay here?" Sarah nodded. "I will. I'm applying for a grant to expand the visitor center and create educational programs. I want to bring school groups here, have workshops about history and social justice, maybe even create an artist residency program for people who want to explore these themes in their work. This place has more to give, more stories to tell." "And what about Emma's journal?" Marcus asked. "The original, where will it be kept?" "The university has offered to preserve it in their special collections archive," Sarah said, "where it will be properly protected and accessible to researchers. But I'm keeping photocopies here, and I'll always have the digital scans." Emma's voice won't be lost. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, then Marcus said, "You know, you're part of the story now too. 100 years from now, someone might be reading about what you did with Emma's legacy, how you honored it and carried it forward." Sarah smiled at the thought. "I hope so. I hope they'll understand that every generation has to decide what kind of people they want to be, what kind of world they want to build. Emma and William made their choice. I'm making mine." As winter set in over the Ozarks, Sarah settled into her new life with contentment and purpose. The cabin, which had seemed so small and isolated when she first arrived, now felt like the center of something important, a hub of connection and meaning. She had found her place, not just in geography but in the flow of time and history, part of a story that stretched back generations and would continue forward long after she was gone. She spent her evenings reading by lamplight, sometimes Emma's journal, sometimes the letters from descendants who had visited, sometimes just books from the small library she was building. She cooked simple meals on the wood stove, finding satisfaction in the physical work of maintaining the cabin and property. She walked the land in all weathers, learning its moods and seasons, feeling increasingly rooted in the mountain soil. On New Year's Eve, as 2025 turned to 2026, Sarah sat at the table where Emma had written her records more than a century ago. She opened a new journal, one she had bought for herself, and began to write. Today marks the beginning of a new year and, in many ways, a new life. I have become the keeper of Emma's legacy, the guardian of stories that might have been lost. This is both a privilege and a responsibility. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I am where I'm supposed to be, doing work that matters. I think Emma would be pleased. I hope she would be proud. I am grateful to her for leaving the trail markers that led me here, for having the foresight to preserve these stories, for believing that someday, someone would care enough to find them and carry them forward. I am that someone. This is my part to play." She closed the journal and looked around the cabin, seeing it with fresh eyes. It was more than just logs and stones now. It was a repository of memory, a testament to courage, a bridge between past and future. The photograph from 1905 sat on the shelf, that calm family with their hidden story. Sarah had uncovered what was hidden, brought it into the light, and in doing so, she had found her own story, her own purpose. Outside, the the mountain was dark and quiet under a blanket of stars. The creek sang its endless song. The forest breathed with ancient rhythms. And in the cabin on Pine Hollow, a new guardian kept watch over old stories, making sure they would not be forgotten, ensuring that the legacy of compassion and courage would continue to inspire new generations to do their part, in their time, to make the world a little better, a little more just.